Hey guys, tonight we begin with the grim, dangerous, and not so glamorous world of medieval assassins. I don't know what time it is where you are, but I'm really glad you're here. Whether you're winding down after a long day or just looking for something calm to fall asleep to, I've got something for you. We're stepping away from the bright lights of the modern world and into the long, flickering shadows of the Middle Ages, a time where history wasn't just written in ink, but often carved out with a whisper and a blade. Before we dive into the mud and the mystery, take a moment to get settled. You deserve this time to disconnect. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, rhythmic background hum, and pull up a heavy blanket. Let your shoulders drop. If you enjoy these nightly journeys into the forgotten corners of the past, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. It truly helps me keep these stories coming. But only do it if you genuinely find value in what we do here. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what the clock says on your side of the world. It's a small world when we all gather in the quiet hours to listen to the echoes of the past. Now, let's set the record straight. If you've played a video game or watched a summer blockbuster lately, you probably have a very specific image of a medieval assassin. You see a brooding athletic figure in tailored leather armor, perched atop a Gothic cathedral, waiting for the perfect moment to perform a gravity-defying leap into a hay bale. You imagine secret societies with vast libraries, hidden mountain fortresses, and a moral code that makes them feel like dark heroes. The reality, being a medieval assassin seriously sucked. There was no Assassin's Academy. No one in the year 1215 woke up, looked at their career options, and decided that professional shadow sounded like a great way to climb the social ladder. In the medieval world, you didn't choose the life of a killer for hire. The life chose you because every other door had been slammed in your face, locked and bolted. Becoming an assassin wasn't a career path. It was a last stop on the life went horribly wrong train. Imagine the social structure of the Middle Ages. It was a world of rigid boxes. You were born a peasant, you died a peasant. You were born a noble, you lived in a drafty stone tower and complained about the price of spices. Everyone had a place. But an assassin was someone who had fallen out of the boxes entirely. You were likely a disgraced soldier who had seen too much blood and couldn't go back to the farm, or a desperate labourer whose family had succumbed to famine, leaving you with nothing but a hunger that wouldn't quit and a conscience that had grown dangerously thin. There was no glory in this. There were no songs written about you. If you did your job well, no one even knew you existed. If you did it poorly, you ended up as a cautionary tale swinging from a gibbet at the city gates. You were the dark engine of political change, the person hired to do the things that honourable men couldn't be seen doing. You were a tool, disposable, replaceable, and meant to be thrown away the moment the job was finished. When we think of the job description, we have to look at the environment. You aren't sneaking through a clean cinematic city. You're navigating a labyrinth of filth. Medieval cities were loud, cramped, and smelled like a combination of open sewers, rotting offal, and unwashed humanity. Your office was a damp alleyway where the mud was ankle deep and the pigs had right of way. You spent your days not in a library, but in a state of perpetual dampness. Your clothes were likely made of heavy, itchy wool that never truly dried out. meaning you spent your professional life smelling like a wet dog while trying to remain invisible. And let's talk about the contract. In the movies, there's a gold-plated coin and a mysterious parchment. In reality, it was a desperate whisper in a back room of a tavern that smelled like sour ale. You weren't asked to take out the Dark Lord. You were asked to take out Jeff the Merchant because he owed the wrong person money, or a minor bishop who had seen a ledger he shouldn't have. The pay, it wasn't a chest of sparkling jewels, it was a handful of clipped silver coins. Just enough to keep you fed for a month and maybe buy a new pair of boots that didn't leak. The irony of the job was the constant need for silence in a world that was incredibly loud. You lived in a state of high alert paranoia. You couldn't trust the person who hired you because the moment the target was dead, you became the only living witness to their crime. You couldn't trust your neighbours because they were all looking for a way to earn a finder's fee from the local magistrate. You were a ghost while you were still breathing. You also had to deal with the physical toll of the waiting. High-stakes assassination isn't all action. It's 99% sitting still in places you shouldn't be. It's crouching in the rafters of a stable for 14 hours, holding your breath every time a guard walks by, feeling the spiders crawl over your neck and the cramps set into your legs. You couldn't sneeze. You couldn't cough. You couldn't stretch. If you made a sound, you weren't just resetting a level. You were inviting a dozen men with polearms to turn you into a human pincushion. There was no membership to protect you, no guild to pay your legal fees. If you were caught, your employer didn't know you. You were just a madman or a thief who had gone too far. The medieval justice system didn't care about motive. It cared about making an example. As you lie there tonight, listening to the hum of your fan, try to imagine that level of cold, bone-deep isolation. You have no home to return to, no family to ask how your day was, and no identity beyond the name of the person you have to remove from the world. You are a footnote in history, a shadow in the corner of a royal portrait, a person who traded their future for a few pieces of silver because the world offered them nothing else. Being a medieval assassin didn't make you a kingmaker, it made you a scavenger. You were the one who cleaned up the mess of the powerful, only to be swept under the rug yourself. It was a life of wet feet, empty stomachs, and a heart that had to be kept under lock and key. But don't worry, you aren't there. You are here, safe and warm, and the only thing you have to eliminate tonight is the stress of the day. So, take another deep breath. Let the weight of the medieval world stay in the past. We're just getting started on this journey, and there's a lot more to uncover about why the glory of the blade was actually just a long, cold walk in the mud. If you spent any time in the modern world, you've likely seen the cinematic version of an assassin's upbringing. It's always the same. A young brooding initiate is taken to a remote, mist-covered mountain monastery. There, they are met by a council of wise, grey-bearded mentors who speak in riddles and move like smoke. The initiate spends years mastering the arts of parkour, leaping from stone spires, and practicing ancient, secret martial arts that allow them to disable 5 guards with a single flick of the wrist. They have uniforms, they have a creed, and they have a sense of purpose that feels almost holy. But as you settle into your blankets tonight and listen to the quiet rhythm of your surroundings, I want you to let that image fade. Let the mist dissolve. Because the reality of training to be a medieval assassin was far less poetic and infinitely more pathetic. There was no hidden monastery. There was no leap of faith. In the real Middle Ages, the only thing you were leaping over was a pile of garbage in a dark alley, and you usually hoped you didn't twist your ankle doing it. The hidden monastery is a beautiful lie we tell ourselves, because we want the past to have a sense of order. We want to believe that even the killers were professionals. But in the 13th century, if you wanted to learn how to remove someone from this world, you didn't go to a school. You went to the streets. Your mentor wasn't a wise philosopher. It was likely a desperate man named stubby-fingered Silas who showed you how to hold a knife, so you didn't accidentally cut your own palm open during the struggle. There were no training manuals. There were no orientation weeks. Your education was purely trial and error, with a very heavy emphasis on the error. Imagine your training camp. It isn't a beautiful courtyard with cherry blossoms and wooden sparring dummies. It's a damp, freezing forest clearing, or the back of a tanner's yard that smells like rotting hides and ammonia. You don't have a master watching your form. You have a straw-filled sack tied to a tree branch. You spend your afternoon stabbing it, over and over, trying to figure out the best way to penetrate heavy wool or boiled leather without the blade getting stuck. Why does the blade getting stuck matter? Because in the real world, a stuck blade is a death sentence. If you stab someone and your knife hit a rib, or gets wedged in a thick tunic, you can't just press a button to retract it. You have to yank. And while you're yanking, your target is screaming and the guards are waking up. And suddenly, your professional job has turned into a chaotic, terrifying wrestling match in the dirt. This leads us to the myth of parkour. We see these characters sprinting across rooftops, jumping from balcony to balcony with the grace of a cat. It looks effortless, but let's look at a medieval city through the lens of physics and hygiene. Most roofs were made of thatch, which is essentially dried grass, or heavy, loose, clay, tiles. If you tried to sprint across a thatched roof, you wouldn't look like a hero. You'd look like a man falling through a ceiling into someone's vegetable stew. If the roof was tile, it was likely covered in a slick layer of soot from the thousands of coal and wood fires burning below. One wrong step, and you aren't performing a leap of faith. You're performing a slide of certain death into a cobblestone street. There was no grace. There was only the sound of clattering tiles and the inevitable shouting of a very angry homeowner. Training, if you can even call it that, was mostly about suppressing your own humanity. You had to train your heart to beat slowly when every instinct told you to run. You had to train your eyes to see in the dark, which mostly just meant spending a lot of time sitting in pitch black rooms until your brain learned to interpret the subtle differences between dark grey and slightly darker grey. You weren't learning martial arts. You were learning how to be a piece of furniture. You were learning how to stand perfectly still for 4 hours behind a tapestry without sneezing or scratching an itch, even as the dust filled your lungs and the moths crawled over your face. And let's talk about the secret weapons. There were no retractable wrist blades. Those are mechanical nightmares that would have broken the moment they hit bone. Your weapon was a dagger, maybe a misericord, a long thin blade designed to slip through the gaps in a knight's armor. But learning to use it wasn't about form or katas. It was about anatomy in its most grisly sense. You had to learn where the vital spots were through hearsay and observation. You had to know that a strike here might take minutes to work, but a strike there might be over in seconds. It was a dark, dirty science practiced by people who couldn't read a book, let alone a medical text. The wise mentor myth also suggests a level of loyalty that simply didn't exist. In a monastery, you have brothers. In the medieval underworld, you have competition. If someone showed you how to do the job, they weren't doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They were likely using you as a distraction or a shield. If you got caught, they weren't going to come for you with a smoke bomb and a daring rescue plan. They were going to disappear into the fog and forget you ever existed. The closest thing to a guild was really just a loose collection of people who were equally desperate. There was no creed about protecting the innocent or serving the light. The only creed was, don't get caught and don't tell them who paid you. As you lie there tonight, safe from the damp and the danger, think about the mental training required for this life. You had to train yourself to forget your own name. You had to train yourself to look at a crowded marketplace, not as a place of community, but as a series of exit routes and obstacles. You were training to become a ghost before you were dead. There was no graduation ceremony. There were no white robes. Your graduation was your first successful job, and your reward wasn't a title or a seat at a high table. It was a small pouch of coins and the realization that you were now a murderer who could never, ever go home. The hidden monastery is a fun story, but the truth is much heavier. The truth is that these were people who had no one to teach them, no one to catch them, and nowhere to go. They were amateurs in a world of professionals trying to survive in the gaps of history. So, let the flashy costumes and the hidden blades stay in the movies. Tonight, we honor the reality, the gritty, unglamorous, and deeply human struggle of people trying to find their way in a world that gave them nothing but a blade and a shadow. Take a deep breath. Feel the softness of your pillow. You don't have to climb any walls tonight. You don't have to watch for guards. The only creed you need to follow tonight is to let go of the day and let the silence take over. When we look at history through the lens of modern entertainment, we tend to see gear as a collection of high-tech gadgets designed for a specific purpose. We imagine the medieval assassin equipped with a leather utility belt, perhaps a few smoke bombs made of rare Eastern powders, and of course, the iconic hidden blade. A marvel of spring-loaded engineering that stays tucked away until the moment of truth. We imagine them wearing tactical black silk that blends into the night, light as air and silent as a heartbeat. But as you sink deeper into your mattress tonight, I want you to listen to the sounds of your own room, the soft whir of the fan, the distant hum of the world. Now, imagine those sounds replaced by the constant, betraying jingle of metal on metal. Because the reality of a medieval assassin's gear wasn't a sleek loadout. It was a loud, heavy, and rusted collection of whatever they could beg, borrow, or steal. There were no hidden blades. There were no smoke bombs. There was only a budget of a shadow, which usually amounted to 0. The most important tool in an assassin's kit wasn't a sword. Swords were for soldiers. A sword was a high-status weapon. It was expensive, it was long, and it was impossible to hide. If you walked into a medieval tavern with a broadsword strapped to your hip, you weren't a shadow, you were a target. You were someone the guards would watch immediately. No, The real weapon of the medieval assassin was the dagger, or more accurately, a glorified kitchen knife that had seen better days. Imagine the blade you're carrying. It's made of iron, not tempered steel. It's pitted with rust from the constant dampness of the English or French countryside. Every time you sharpen it on a river stone, you lose a little bit more of the edge. It doesn't have a balanced weight. It doesn't have a leather-bound grip. It has a splintering wooden handle that bites into your palm. And because you don't have a custom-fit scabbard, you're likely carrying it tucked directly into your belt or hidden in a roll of burlap. Every time you move, you're terrified the blade will slip and cut your own thigh, a common, unglamorous injury that probably ended more careers than the City Watch ever did. And then there's the 7-foot longbow. Hollywood loves a sniper, and the longbow was the sniper rifle of the Middle Ages. But have you ever tried to be mysterious while carrying a piece of yew wood that is taller than you are? A longbow isn't something you can fold up and put in a backpack. It is a massive, cumbersome stick. To carry it through a city, you have to disguise it. Maybe you wrap it in a muddy cloak and pretend you're carrying a load of firewood. But a cloak that can hide a 7-foot bow is heavy, and it's wet, and it drags in the filth of the street. You aren't gliding through the shadows. You're lumbering like a pack mule, sweating under the weight of your own equipment, praying that no one asks why your firewood is so perfectly curved. Let's talk about the assassin's uniform. The idea of wearing all black is a modern invention. In the Middle Ages, black dye was incredibly expensive. It was the colour of high-ranking clergy and the ultra-wealthy. If you wore jet black clothing in a medieval village, you stood out like a sore thumb. To truly be a shadow, you had to wear the colours of the earth: mud brown, slate grey, and a dull, faded green. You didn't want to look like a shadow. You wanted to look like a peasant who hadn't washed their tunic in 3 years. Your stealth gear was likely a tattered wool cloak that smelled of wood smoke and damp sheep. It was itchy. It was heavy when it rained, and it provided zero protection against a guard's poleaxe. But the biggest enemy of the medieval assassin wasn't the guards. It was friction. In a world before plastic or rubber, everything was made of wood, iron, or leather. And those things make noise. If you had a few coins in your pocket, they jingled. If your dagger hit your belt buckle, it clinked. If your leather boots were wet, they squeaked on the cobblestones with every single step. The budget of a shadow meant you spent your nights wrapping your gear in scraps of old linen or oily rags just to keep it quiet. You had to tie your coins into a knot in your undershirt. You had to grease your boot soles with animal fat to keep the leather from groaning. You were a walking collection of improvised silencers, constantly adjusting your clothes to make sure a stray piece of metal didn't ring out in the middle of a silent hallway. And what about smoke bombs? In the movies, the assassin throws a glass vial, a cloud of grey smoke appears, and they vanish. In reality, the closest thing a medieval assassin had to a smoke bomb was a literal fire. If you wanted a distraction, you had to set something on fire. This required flint, steel, and tinder, a process that took several minutes of frantic striking and blowing on embers. There was no vanishing. There was only starting a small trash fire and hoping the guards were distracted enough for you to limp away into the darkness. The tools of the trade were often just everyday objects repurposed for violence. a heavy blacksmith's hammer, a length of hemp rope that was more likely to snap than to hold your weight, a handful of caltrops, simple iron spikes designed to hurt the feet of pursuing horses. But even these were expensive and heavy to carry. Most of the time, your gear was whatever was within arm's reach: a heavy stone, a stout branch, or the darkness itself. Think about the physical burden of this. You are cold, you are hungry, and you are carrying 30 pounds of damp wool and rusted iron. Your gear doesn't make you feel powerful. It makes you feel vulnerable. You are constantly checking to see if your knife is still there, if your bowstring is dry, if your boots are going to hold together for one more mile. There is no high-tech maintenance. Your maintenance is a bit of lard to keep the rust off and a prayer that the wood of your bow doesn't crack in the frost. As you lie there tonight, feel the lightness of your own life. You don't have to worry about your belt jingling. You don't have to hide a 7-foot weapon under your blankets. You are surrounded by the incredible gear of the modern world: soft cotton, controlled heat, and a silence that doesn't feel like a threat. The medieval assassin was a man of compromises. He traded speed for warmth, silence for protection, and glory for survival. He was a master of making something out of nothing, of turning a kitchen tool into a political statement. But he was always just one jingle away from the end. Take a deep breath. Let the imaginary weight of that muddy cloak fall away from your shoulders. Your equipment for tonight is simple: a pillow, a blanket, and the permission to let go. You've earned this rest. You don't have to be a shadow anymore. You can just be you. In the flickering candlelight of our modern imagination, poison is the ultimate weapon of the refined assassin. We picture a silent, sophisticated killer leaning over a golden chalice, letting a single, colourless drop of Kingsbane fall into the wine. In the movies, the king takes a sip, gasps, and falls dead within seconds, his face turning a dramatic shade of purple as the assassin slips out the back door. It's clean, it's elegant, and it's completely, utterly wrong. As you settle into the stillness of your room tonight, let the idea of elegant chemistry drift away, because the reality of medieval poisoning wasn't a science. It was a messy, terrifying, and deeply unpredictable gamble. It was the poisoner's paradox. The more important your target was, the more impossible they were to poison. If you wanted to take out a king, you weren't just fighting a man. You were fighting an entire fortress of biology, paranoia, and a very dedicated circle of royal food tasters. To understand why poisoning sucked, you first have to understand the tech of the time. There were no lab-grade toxins. Most medieval poison was essentially a collection of things you found in the woods or the back of a damp cellar. You had hemlock, nightshade, and henbane. You had arsenic, which occurred naturally in minerals but was difficult to purify. And then you had the creativity of the desperate. Ground up emeralds, which did nothing but make the wine crunchy, toad secretions, or rotted meat. The first problem was consistency. You didn't have a dropper bottle. You had a handful of dried roots you'd crushed between two rocks. One batch of nightshade might be potent enough to stop a heart, while the next might just give the king a particularly vivid dream and a case of the sweats. You were eyeballing the dose in a world where a pinch too much meant the wine smelled like a swamp, and a pinch too little meant you just gave your enemy a slightly unpleasant afternoon. Now, Imagine you've actually managed to acquire a decent toxin. Now comes the real challenge, the royal gauntlet. A medieval king didn't just sit down and eat a sandwich. Every meal was a military operation. First, you had the prickers and tasters. Before a dish even reached the royal table, it had to pass through the credence. This was a formal ritual where the high-ranking servants, men whose entire lives depended on the king's survival, would take a small portion of every single dish. They would drink the wine first. They would eat the bread first. They would taste the pottage. If you'd used a fast-acting poison, the taster would be on the floor before the king even picked up his spoon. If you used a slow-acting one, the king might still notice the taster looking a bit peaked and decide to skip the venison. And it wasn't just humans. You were also up against the royal dogs. In many medieval courts, the king's favourite hounds lived under the table. It was common practice to toss a scrap of meat to the dog before the king took a bite. If the dog keeled over, the feast was over and the search for the assassin began. To be a successful poisoner, you didn't just have to kill a king. You had to outsmart a professional taster and a very hungry wolfhound, all while trying to look like a humble servant who definitely didn't have grey powder under his fingernails. Then there was the taste of death. Medieval people weren't stupid. They knew that many poisons had a bitter, metallic, or acrid flavour. This led to the spice arms race. This is one of the reasons medieval food was so heavily spiced with cinnamon, pepper, ginger, and cloves. It wasn't just to show off wealth, it was to cover up the taste of off meat, or, more importantly, the bitter tang of hemlock. If a king took a bite of something and it tasted slightly off, he didn't just swallow it, he'd spit it out and call for the guards. You had to balance your poison against a literal mountain of ginger, praying that the target was distracted enough by the conversation to not notice the slight burning in his throat. But let's say you were perfect. You found a tasteless mineral. You slipped past the taster. The dog was sleeping. The king ate the whole bowl. Even then, the chemistry of the Middle Ages would often betray you. The human body is remarkably good at rejecting things that shouldn't be there. Instead of a silent, dramatic death, most medieval poisonings resulted in violent public illness. The target wouldn't just pass away. They would spend 3 days in a very loud, very messy state of gastrointestinal distress. This was the worst-case scenario for an assassin. A dead king is a tragedy. A sick king is a manhunt. If the king survived the first few hours, he had time to think. He had time to remember who served the wine. He had time to order the torture of every kitchen boy and scullery maid until someone pointed a finger. Most poisonings didn't end with a change in the throne. They ended with the assassin being drawn and quartered because their lethal dose only managed to ruin the king's weekend. And we can't forget the antidote myth. Medieval kings were obsessed with universal antidotes, like the famous Mithridatium, a concoction of 65 ingredients, including bits of vipers and various herbs. They would take small amounts of it every day, hoping to build an immunity. While this probably just gave them chronic indigestion, it added a layer of psychological armor. The king believed he was invincible, and in the world of assassination, a target who isn't afraid is a target who is much harder to rattle. Think about the stress of being that poisoner. You're standing in the corner of a loud, hot, crowded, great hall. You're wearing a disguise that's itchy, and too small. You have a vial of ground-up mushrooms in your palm, and your hand won't stop shaking. You have to wait for the perfect moment to move, all while the tasters are watching, the guards are pacing, and the royal dogs are sniffing at your boots. It's not a game of shadows. It's a game of absolute bone-chilling terror. As you lie there tonight, let your stomach feel light and easy. You don't have to worry about what's in your glass. You don't have to have a taster for your midnight snack. You live in a world of food safety, clear labelling, and a complete lack of royal intrigue. The medieval poisoner was a desperate gambler playing a game where the house always won. They traded their lives for a maybe, for a toxin that probably wouldn't work, against a defense system that was designed to catch them. They weren't master chemists. They were frightened people with a handful of bad ideas. Take a deep breath. Feel the coolness of the air in your lungs. The Poisoner's Paradox is a story from a darker time, a reminder of how complicated and messy the past truly was. In the world of cinema, a castle is a playground for an assassin. We see them scaling smooth stone walls with their bare hands, slipping through open windows, and dancing across rafters, while guards below stare obliviously into the distance. To Hollywood, medieval architecture is a series of convenient ledges and poorly lit hallways designed specifically for a protagonist to exploit. It looks effortless, athletic, and, most importantly, clean. But as you settle into the safety of your own four walls, tonight, I want you to appreciate the stillness. Because for a medieval assassin, a castle wasn't a playground. It was a psychological and physical nightmare. It was a structure designed by people who were obsessively, clinically paranoid. These buildings weren't just homes. They were stone machines built to trap, confuse, and kill anyone who wasn't invited. This was the original death trap, and sneaking into one was less like a dance, and more like a slow, terrifying crawl through a meat grinder. Let's start with the first thing an assassin would encounter: the moat. In the movies, the moat is a picturesque ring of clear blue water. The assassin swims across it silently, emerges on the other side, and shakes off a few droplets like a trained athlete. In reality, a medieval moat was essentially a stagnant, open-air cesspool. Everything that left the castle, kitchen scraps, animal waste, and the contents of the latrines, went straight down into that water. To swim across a moat was to immerse yourself in a thick, freezing slurry of bacteria and filth. By the time you reached the base of the wall, you weren't a shadow. You were a shivering, soaking wet mess, covered in a stench so powerful it would alert a guard 2 floors up. If you had even a tiny scratch on your hand from sharpening that rusty dagger, the moat would ensure you wouldn't survive the week, regardless of whether the guards caught you. But let's say you made it across. Now you face the walls. Medieval stonework wasn't made of convenient, hand-sized grips. Most high-status castles were plastered and whitewashed to look imposing and smooth. There were no ledges, there were no gaps. And even if you found a way up, you were climbing into the kill zone. Medieval architects were masters of the murder hole. These were literal gaps in the ceilings of gatehouses and overhanging walkways. If you were spotted, the guards didn't just come out to fight you. They stayed safely behind stone and poured down whatever they had boiling on the stove. It wasn't always oil. Oil was expensive. Usually it was boiling water, heated sand, which worked its way into every gap in your clothes and burned through to the bone. or even worse, quicklime. You weren't a warrior. You were a pest being hosed off a wall. Now imagine you've actually found a way inside. Maybe you bribed a servant or hid in a supply wagon. You are finally within the inner sanctum. This is where the architecture of paranoia really begins. Medieval staircases were almost always built as tight spirals, turning clockwise as they went up. Why? Because most people are right-handed. This design meant that a defender coming down the stairs had plenty of room to swing their sword, while an attacker coming up had their weapon arm constantly hitting the central stone pillar. Every inch of the building was a mathematical advantage for the person who lived there, and a disadvantage for you. And then there were the trip steps. To prevent someone from running through the dark, masons would intentionally make one step in a flight slightly higher or shallower than the rest. The residents knew where it was. Their muscles had mapped the stairs over years of living there. But you're a stranger in a hurry. You hit that uneven step in the dark, your foot slips, your gear jingles, and you go tumbling down a stone throat. This brings us to the guards and the cold problem. Hollywood guards are usually bored and deaf, but real medieval guards were often local men who knew every single sound of their hallway. They knew which floorboard creaked. They knew how the wind sounded when the door was properly shut. And most importantly, they were standing in a drafty, freezing stone hallway, with absolutely nothing to do but listen. Now imagine you're that assassin. You've been hiding in a damp moat and crouching in a freezing cellar for 6 hours. You have developed a head cold. Your nose is running, your throat is tickling, and you are gripped by the absolute bone-shaking need to sneeze. In a modern world, a sneeze is a minor annoyance. In a medieval castle, a sneeze is a flare gun. You are in a stone tube. Every sound is magnified. A single achoo echoes off the vaulted ceilings, travels down the spiral stairs, and alerts 50 men who've been waiting for anything to break the silence of their shift. You have to spend your entire mission pressing your finger against your upper lip, praying to every saint you can name that your sinuses don't betray you. It is a level of stress that ruins the cool factor of the job instantly. The layout itself was a trap. Important rooms weren't just behind one door. They were behind layers of antechambers. To get to a baron's bedroom, you might have to pass through a room where his squires slept, then a room where his personal servants slept, and finally a door that was bolted from the inside. There were no back doors to a lord's bedchamber. Privacy didn't really exist in the way we think of it. The powerful were surrounded by a human shield of sleeping bodies at all times. To get to your target, you had to step over 5 people who were sleeping light, because they knew their lives depended on it. And let's not forget the dogs. Medieval castles were full of them. Hunting hounds, mastiffs, and small lap dogs that were more like furry alarms. They didn't care about your stealth. They smelled the moat water on your boots and the fear in your sweat long before you even reached the door. Think about the physical exhaustion, the constant damp, the dizzying stairs, the weight of the stone pressing in on you from all sides. You aren't a predator. You're a mouse in a clockwork box, and the cat is everywhere. The architecture wasn't just there to keep enemies out. It was there to make anyone who got in feel small, confused, and exposed. As you lie there tonight, take a moment to look at your own ceiling. It's flat. There are no murder holes. Your floor is level. There are no trip steps. Your air is warm and dry, and if you need to sneeze, you can do so without a dozen men with spears bursting through your door. The original death trap of the castle is a relic of a time when the world was built on a foundation of total mistrust. It was a masterpiece of cruelty and engineering. But tonight, your home is a masterpiece of peace. You don't have to navigate a maze. You don't have to climb a cesspit. You just have to lie still. In the stories we tell today, the lone wolf is a figure of envy. We see the silent protagonist sitting in the corner of a dimly lit tavern, mysterious and cool, burdened by a secret past, but fundamentally in control. We imagine that their isolation is a choice, a badge of honor that sets them apart from the mundane lives of the masses. In fiction, the assassin's solitude is a superpower. It makes them untouchable, unreadable, and undeniably fascinating. But as you sink into the warmth of your bed tonight, listening to the soft, familiar sounds of your life, maybe the breathing of a partner, the rustle of a pet, or just the comforting silence of a home that knows your name, I want you to consider a different kind of silence. Because for the medieval assassin, isolation wasn't a vibe or a choice. It was a friendship vacuum. It was a total, crushing erasure of the human connection that makes life worth living. Being a medieval assassin didn't just mean killing others. It meant killing every part of yourself that needed to be known, loved, or remembered. The mental toll of this life was a slow-acting poison, deadlier than anything you could slip into a chalice. It started with the simple realization that if you told anyone the truth, you were dead. In the Middle Ages, survival was built on community. You were defined by your guild, your parish, your family, or your village. To exist without a group was to be a non-person, but an assassin could never truly join a group. You couldn't have a wife or a husband because intimacy requires honesty. Imagine lying in the dark with someone who trusts you, hearing them talk about their hopes for the future, while your hands are still stained with the work you did that afternoon. You couldn't tell them. You couldn't share the weight. To let someone in was to hand them a death warrant. If the authorities found out what you did, they wouldn't just come for you. They'd come for everyone you loved to ensure the rot was fully removed. So, you chose the vacuum. You lived a life of shallow interactions and practiced lies. You weren't a husband. You were a traveling tinker. You weren't a father. You were a distant relative passing through. You spent your entire life playing a character, and after a decade of that, you eventually forgot who the actor was beneath the mask. And then there's the dog problem. We think of dogs as the ultimate companions for the lonely, but a medieval assassin couldn't even have a loyal hound. Why? Because dogs are honest. Dogs bark when a stranger approaches. Dogs follow you when you're trying to slip away into the night. Dogs provide a pattern, a recognizable silhouette that people remember. If you're a ghost, you can't have a shadow that barks. You had to look at a stray puppy in the street and keep walking, hardening your heart against the simplest form of companionship, because your life depended on being utterly unremarkable and entirely alone. Even the favorite bartender was a luxury you couldn't afford. In the medieval world, the tavern was the heart of information. Everyone knew everyone. If you went to the same place twice, you became a regular. People noticed your habits. They noticed that you always sat with your back to the wall. They noticed that you never got drunk enough to lose your edge. They noticed that you had coins, but no clear trade. To be noticed was to be hunted. So, you became a nomad of the city. You drank in a different cellar every night. You never looked the innkeeper in the eye. You never joined the song. You lived in the busiest parts of the world and remained as isolated as a hermit on a mountain peak. The psychological pressure of this masking is hard to overstate. Every conversation was a minefield. If someone asked, "Where are you from?" you had to have a story ready. A story that was boring enough to be forgotten, but detailed enough to be believed. You had to monitor your own body language. Did you flinch when the guard walked in? Did you touch your belt where your knife is hidden? You were in a state of high-level paranoia every waking second of your life. Over time, this changes the brain. You stop seeing people as humans and start seeing them as variables. That woman at the well, she's a witness. That child playing in the street, he's an obstacle. The person smiling at you, they're a potential threat. You lose the ability to feel empathy because empathy is a liability. If you feel for your target, you hesitate. If you hesitate, you die. To survive, you had to turn yourself into a stone, cold, heavy, and incapable of warmth. But the vacuum doesn't stay empty. It fills with guilt and ghosting. In a world that believed in a literal heaven and hell, the medieval assassin lived with the constant knowledge that they were damned. There was no assassin's heaven. You were breaking the most sacred laws of God and man. When you sat alone in the dark, you weren't thinking about your kill count like a game score. You were thinking about the faces of the people you'd removed. The way the bishop looked surprised. The way the merchant's hands shook. You were haunted by ghosts that only you could see. And because of the vacuum, you had no one to help you carry the burden. There was no mental health in the 14th century. There was only the confessional, and even that was a trap. You couldn't tell a priest your sins without risking the gallows. You were the only person in the world who knew the truth of your soul. And that is a terrifyingly lonely way to exist. As you lie there tonight, take a moment to appreciate the human noise in your life. The text messages from friends, the small talk with the person at the grocery store, the knowledge that people know who you are and where you live. These things are the fabric of a healthy mind. You are connected. You are seen. You are part of the web. The medieval assassin was a man who had cut every string. He was floating in a void of his own making, surrounded by a world that would scream in horror if they truly knew him. He traded the warmth of a hearth and the touch of a hand for a few years of survival and a name that would never be etched on a gravestone. He was the ultimate outsider, not because he wanted to be, but because the job demanded that he stop being human. In the flickering stories of our modern age, there is a certain honor among thieves. We imagine the assassin returning from a successful mission to a smoky back room where a shadowy client slides a heavy chest of gold across a table. There's a nod of mutual respect, a professional acknowledgement that the job was done, the price was met, and both parties can now go their separate ways. It's a clean transaction, governed by a dark but functional set of rules. But as you let your eyes grow heavy tonight, I want you to consider the reality of a medieval contract, because in the 1300s, there was no HR department for killers. There were no escrow accounts. There was only the client problem. In the brutal hierarchy of the Middle Ages, the person who hired you wasn't your employer. They were your most immediate and terrifying threat. To a nobleman or a merchant, an assassin was a loose end with a heartbeat. And in their world, the easiest way to tie a loose end was with a length of rope or a quiet blade in the back. This was the era of the half-now, half-never payment plan. Imagine you are that assassin. You've spent weeks in the cold, lived on scraps, and successfully navigated the original death trap of a local manor to eliminate a rival. You are exhausted, you are terrified, and you are owed the rest of your silver. You go to the meeting place, perhaps a lonely bridge or a ruined chapel. But as you wait in the dark, you realize a fundamental truth of medieval economics. Dead men don't collect debts, and dead men don't tell secrets. To the client, paying you was a double loss. First, they lost the actual gold, which was incredibly scarce and valuable. Second, by letting you live, they allowed the only person who could link them to a capital crime to continue walking the earth. If you were captured by the authorities later, you might talk to save your own neck. If you got drunk at a tavern, you might brag. To a high-ranking lord, you were a ticking time bomb of evidence. The rational business decision wasn't to pay you. It was to have you eliminated the moment the target was cold. The half-now part of the deal was usually just enough to cover your basic supplies, a bit of food, maybe a better knife, or a bribe for a stable boy. It was the bait on the hook. The half later was the lure that brought you back into the client's reach after the dirty work was finished. Think about the psychological toll of this secondary hunt. You've just finished the most dangerous mission of your life, but you can't relax. You can't celebrate. You have to approach your own boss with the same level of stealth and paranoia that you used on your target. You have to watch their hands. Are they reaching for a purse, or are they signaling the archers hidden in the tree line? Every meeting was a potential ambush. This created a bizarre, stagnant cycle of betrayal. Assassins would often demand the full payment up front, but no client was foolish enough to give a desperate person a bag of gold and expect them to actually go through with a suicide mission. And so, the two parties engaged in a dance of mutual distrust. You were working for someone who despised you, to kill someone you didn't know, for money you probably wouldn't live to spend. There was also the problem of the middleman. To protect themselves, powerful clients rarely hired assassins directly. They used cutouts, unscrupulous lawyers, disgraced knights, or tavern fixers. This meant that by the time the money reached you, it had been taxed by 3 different people. But more importantly, it meant the person who held your life in their hands had no personal loyalty to you. To the middleman, you were just a tool that had outlived its usefulness. If they killed you, they could keep your second half of the payment for themselves and tell the client the job was cleansed. The client problem turned the entire profession into a race against time. You had to get your money and disappear into a different kingdom before the client's cleanup crew found your trail. You weren't just hiding from the law, you were hiding from the very person who had put the knife in your hand. It's a stark contrast to the world we live in today. As you lie there, think about the simple, mundane beauty of a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. You have contracts, you have labour laws, and you have a society that, for the most part, doesn't solve its contractual disputes with a crossbow bolt. You can trust that the people you work with want you to show up again tomorrow. You are a valued part of a system, not a secret to be buried. The medieval assassin lived in a world where the hand that fed you was usually the hand that held the dagger. They were caught in a blood paradox. The more successful they were at their job, the more dangerous they became to their employer, and the shorter their life expectancy dropped. There was no such thing as a loyal client. There was only the predator and the prey, and the roles could switch in a single heartbeat. Let the stress of the blood contract fade away. The clients, the middlemen, and the clipped silver coins are all dust now. The shadows in your room are just shadows, soft, familiar, and silent. You are safe from the betrayals of the past. You've made it through the politics and the poison, the castles and the clients. As we reach the final stretch of our journey tonight, I want you to take a long, slow breath. Feel the weight of your limbs as they sink into the mattress. The story is winding down, and the flickering torches of the medieval world are beginning to dim, one by one. We've looked at the filth of the moats, the terror of the friendship vacuum, and the betrayal of the clients. Now we have to ask the final question. What happened to the ones who survived? What was the retirement plan for a man who made his living in the dark? In our modern world, we think of retirement as a reward. We imagine a gold watch, a quiet garden, and a sense of pride in a job well done. We look forward to the day when we can finally put down our tools and simply be. But for the medieval assassin, success didn't lead to a garden. It led to a different kind of prison, one made of silence and a new set of names. There was no pension. There was no assassin's rest. If you were one of the rare few who managed to survive a decade of damp walls, rusted blades, and treacherous employers, your reward was the privilege of disappearing. To retire meant to perform one last, final assassination. You had to kill your own identity. You moved to a village 3 counties away, where the accent was different and no one knew your face. You became Thomas the Weaver or Peter the Shepherd. You traded your iron dagger for a wooden loom or a shepherd's crook. But while the tools in your hands changed, the mind behind the eyes stayed the same. This was the shallow grave of the soul. You had to bury your past so thinly that you were always aware of it, just beneath the surface. You lived with a permanent, bone-deep set of trust issues. When a neighbour knocked on your door to offer a loaf of bread, you didn't see a gesture of kindness. You saw a potential witness. When a stranger rode into town, you didn't see a traveller. You saw a cleaner sent by an old client to settle an ancient debt. You lived in a state of perpetual success that felt exactly like failure. You were safe, but you were never at peace. You spent your evenings by a small fire, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, wondering if the next sound you heard would be the floorboards creaking under the weight of someone who looked just like you used to look. Your retirement wasn't a rest, it was a long, quiet vigil. But as we look back through the fog of time, there is a certain respect we must pay to these shadows of history. The medieval world was a place of staggering chaos and casual cruelty. It was a world where the powerful often operated without consequence, and the desperate were left to navigate the gaps. These assassins, as grim as their work was, were products of their environment. They were the unintended consequences of a society that offered no justice for the small and no safety for the weak. Tonight, we can appreciate the incredible, quiet miracle of the world we live in now. We enjoy a safety that would have seemed like magic to a person in the 1300s. We have laws that protect us. We have homes that are built for comfort, not for defense. We have friends we can trust with our real names and our real stories. We live in the light because of the hard lessons learned in the dark centuries that came before us. The chaos they survived, the loneliness they endured, and even the shallow graves they dug for their own identities have all contributed to the foundation of the world we sleep in tonight. We can learn from their desperation without having to feel it. We can study their shadows from the safety of our blankets. So, take one last deep breath. Let the images of the medieval underworld dissolve into the shadows of your room. The rusty knives are gone. The moats have dried up. The paranoid clients have been forgotten by time. There are no more missions, no more disguises, and no more secrets to keep. You have reached the end of the road for tonight. Your retirement plan is much better than theirs. Your plan is to let go of the day, to let the muscles in your face relax, and to let your mind drift into the deep, restorative silence of sleep. You don't have to be a shadow. You don't have to be a ghost. You can just be a person, safe and sound, in a world that is at peace. The history books are closing. The torches are burned out. The story is over. And the rest is yours. Good night.